Many thanks for staying tuned. It's still the conversation here on Lagos Television. Of course, today we'll be taking a look at the proposed minimum wage. Of course, workers are still in the waiting game between the federal government, organized labor, and the state government. For some time now, there have been back and forth between organized labor and the federal government on what the new minimum wage should be in Nigeria. You recall, Labour had proposed 615,000 naira at the initial stage. Later, it was reviewed further down, and as we speak, the federal government is still on paying 62,000 naira, even as suggested by the tripartite committee, which was, of course, a committee instituted by the federal government of Nigeria. But as we speak, we do not know where we are at the moment. It's still a game of back and forth between all concerned. But the President, Bola Tinubu, says the new minimum wage bill will be sent to the National Assembly, and Labour insists this should not be done until Labour is also in the know or has accepted to all of this. How much more do workers still need to wait as this back and forth continues? We have a guest in the house this morning. He's a journalist, Adewale Adeoye. Thank you for being here this morning. All right, let's start this way. We know that, of course, we've been going back and forth as to whether or not government will be able to pay what Labour is asking, and government is saying we cannot pay, we can only pay 62,000. Labour is saying we cannot accept that based on current realities on ground. But for you as a Nigerian, as a keen watcher of what is going on in the country as we speak, would you say that on the part of the federal government of Nigeria, there is a genuine sincerity?
Well, I think there are basic things we need to get right in the first place. The first one is that in spite of the disagreement between the stakeholders, there is a lowest common factor, which is that all Nigerians, whether Nigerian Labour Congress or federal government or state government, agree that there is a need for an increase, both Labour and then we also agree, we're on the same page in terms of the cost of living, that most Nigerians cannot afford the essentials of life, basic things of life, and that inflation is going up. We are talking about 33.7% now, and things are becoming far more difficult for every Nigerian. I think on that we are on the same page, whether Labour
or the government.
Yes, or the government. The area of disagreement is about the salary increase, the minimum wage. And when we are talking about minimum wage, we are talking about the minimum expectation that a worker should earn at the end of every month. How do we calculate the minimum wage? It's about 8 hours in a day, minimum of 5 days in a week. And this is not just a moral issue, it's also a legal statutory issue, because we have the national minimum wage of 2019, which says that minimum wage was increased to 30,000 naira. And Section 3, subsection 4 of that law says that every 5 years, the minimum wage
must be reviewed.
So it's a legal issue that we all need to agree. However, I think there are areas of disagreement. The first one is how much, what should be the minimum wage for every Nigerian, and the second one is who should pay this minimum wage in terms of the state government, the federal government, how should it be paid? So I think Labour came out with certain figures. It started with about 600,000, then reduced it to 494. So, for us who are keen watchers, whatever figure anybody is coming up with, it must be scientific. It must be based on the objective realities and the subjective realities of the economy. Can Nigeria afford to pay 600,000 naira? For me, if you ask me what should be the minimum wage, I will actually suggest maybe 700,000 naira. But then, let us weigh the implications. It's easy to band the figures, but we have to look at what will be the impact on the economic equilibrium. If, for instance, you pay 500,000 naira, can every state afford that same amount? What is the GDP of Lagos? What is the GDP of Jigawa State? What is the GDP of Nasarawa State? Do they have the same? Are they on the same page?
Okay.
Then what is even the GDP of Nigeria itself? We are talking about 407 billion, naira. So can Nigeria afford to pay this kind of funds? And if we pay this, what will be the chain impact on the overall economy? Because if you are paying about 500,000 naira, there is a prospect that every other cost for housing, tomatoes, onions, everything will go up.
Right.
And we may end up having hyperinflation, which should be counterproductive. So that's why I think the Nigerian Labour Congress and the federal government should come out with a realistic option, a very honest and transparent position that is formed by scientific analysis of the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities of the economy itself.
Okay.
Okay. Looking at the reality of today now, what's the committee proposed, which is 62,000 naira, the cost of living, rent, school fees, and every other thing that an average worker is expected to spend his or her money on monthly. Do you think 62,000 naira is ideal in the economy of today?
I think if you are paying 62,000 naira, let's just look at prices in practical terms. If somebody earns 62,000 naira and is living in a one-bedroom flat, self-contained, you are most likely to pay about minimum of 25,000 naira for electricity out of that 62,000 naira. Your transport cost, let us assume you spend 1,000 naira per day, and you go out 20 days in a month out of 30 days. So we are talking about 20,000 naira on transportation.
So that's 45,000.
So that's 45,000 naira gone. Then you are talking about access to health. My child had infection this week. I went to the hospital. I was asked to pay 12,000 naira just to do blood test. Then just for malaria is 5,000 naira. Then blood count 12,000 naira.
That's 17,000.
We are not talking about medicine. We wanted to buy antibiotics. The most common one, we are talking about 30,000 naira. I couldn't afford it. At my level, at my status, I had to resort into using herbs. Because that's the reality. I couldn't afford it. So I had to go back home. I did the test of only malaria. I couldn't do typhoid, 5,000 naira. After paying that money, then I went and tried to price the cost of antibiotics. I discovered I couldn't
afford it.
meet up. And we are talking about millions of Nigerians who are even lesser in terms of their economic status, than some people like us who are living in rural areas, who have we are prone to mosquitoes, we are prone to cholera, we are prone to all sorts of diseases. So when you are looking at that amount, 62,000 naira, I've just listed
housing allowance, feeding, transportation.
So feeding is not there.
It is suicide.
You pay school fees.
You pay school fees. You are talking about even buying, your telephone. You are talking about buying food. We are not even talking about food. Let's say you are a family with 2 children. So we are in a more or less sitting on a time bomb. And I think when you find yourself in a situation like this, you have to be, you have to be honest and critical and put on your thinking cap on the side of government. Okay. What are the things that we can do to deal with this situation? We know there are historical problems. For instance, what we passed through last year, when the government was laying so many landmines, the CBN, the Naira swap, so about not less than 2 million CMS collapsed. People could not access their own funds kept in their own banks. So many businesses collapsed because they were trying to change the Naira. So, and then in the time of election, so they mess up the whole economy. And if you look at the depth of the country, so we appreciate that the government that is in power today is facing a very terrible problem, which is also historical. But how did you resolve this problem? How can you tackle it? One of the things I think the government can do is to also look inwards. Have a kind of cut the cost of governance. How much do we spend on diesel in the state houses? How many cars do we buy for people in the House of Assembly? For the people in the National Assembly, we bought 160 million naira per person. Can we cut down on this cost so that we can have some access for Nigerians to also have access to means of livelihood?
Adewale, all of those things you raised, are germane issues. But in the midst of all of this, the governors, especially rising from their meeting last week, the Southern Governors Forum, are looking at a way where the governors can determine or ask each state to determine their minimum wage. If peradventure that fails, which a call that Labour has vehemently kicked against anyway, but if that is considered, will it still be a minimum wage at that time? Because we know that some of the governors at the moment are not even paying 30,000 naira, which of course was agreed on in 2019. So if the governors are now allowed to dictate what the pay, will it still be a minimum wage according to that law? And do you think that this call in the first instance is one in the right direction?
Well, I think I understand the position of Labour. What Labour is trying to defend is collective bargaining, which is a Labour tactics, because if you allow the Nigerian Labour Congress, established 1978, has about 42 industrial unions.
Yes, affiliates.
The CUC, 2005, senior staff associations and all that, maybe about 19 affiliate organizations. So it's not good for them for their ranks to be divided,
right,
so that they negotiate
with one voice.
Okay. So they need to come up with collective bargaining. But at the same time, the reality also is that the strength of each state differ. It varies. Look at what Lagos State, the number of civil servants in Lagos, we are talking about over 100,000. You cannot compare this with Jigawa State that gets maybe about 45 million naira IGR, compared with Lagos that gets over 600 billion naira. So you have to look at all these realities that Lagos State may not be able to pay the same amount with Borno State.
Okay.
Borno State may not be able to pay the same amount with Ekiti State, but there should be the lowest minimum.
There has to be a cap.
Yes, there should be, which is the national minimum wage.
Okay.
That no state must go below this level. Below this level. So I think that is where the federal government needs to assert its moral authority to ensure that, look, every state, you can't go beyond this level.
There has to be a cap.
There has to be a cap.
Okay.
And also, the other states that are saying that they cannot even pay 30,000 naira, they have to look inwards. They need to cut a lot of costs. For instance, if you are in a state like Jigawa State and maybe you have about 200 million naira for security for the governor, the most important security is feeding. So if you are just talking about buying weapons and all that, there is nothing as important as ensuring that people have access to the essential food. When people cannot they cannot feed, when they have no access to food, they will be angry, they will be desperate, and they will be tempted to resort to all sorts of means to survive, including breaking the law, including resorting to violence, including resorting to desperation to ensure that if they cannot live within the law, they will be compelled to live outside the law.
So, okay, some have also accused the governors that they are trying to connive against Labour because now they get more money from the federal government. Just last week, the federal government equally promised that each state in the country, they will be getting 10 billion naira. And Labour are saying that, okay, we see our governors, we see what they do, we see the quality of life that they have, the retinue of aides that they have. We cannot place that side by side with what an average worker in Nigeria is going through. Yeah. So how do you want Labour to see that these governors are indeed sincere and, of course, telling the truth that they cannot afford the new national minimum wage?
If you look at this lifestyle of some of our political leaders, not all of them, some of them, there is that high temptation to doubt that, look, these people don't have money to pay. Because if the first thing, an administration comes to power, if the first thing that government does is to buy new cars for government officials, running into billions of naira, and then the next thing is that you buy traditional rulers, maybe almost about 100 of them, new cars, each one getting about 10 million naira. And you have a traditional ruler that uses a car of 15 million from the government or 10 million, but there's no borehole in that community. Borehole that will just cost about 1 million naira. If you go to the health center, the drugs there, the medicine there is not worth up to 100,000 naira. But the traditional ruler is using a vehicle that is about 15,000 naira, 15 million naira. So we are talking in terms of scale of preference, that the governors should put the interests of the people first. If you look at all these kind of issues that Labour is talking about, of course, the civil servants are members of the Nigerian Labour Congress, so they know the figures that are passing from one table to the other. They know their approval for security vote, for money that goes to other sort of things, that are not should not be of priority, to every state. So I think if we can get our priority right, we'll be able to address this problem. Look at what happened last year or early this year. Each state was giving 2 billion naira as palliatives. Then what they did was that they bought rice, they bought Indomie, people will eat this, and after 2-3 days,
They'll get hungry again.
If each state had invested 2 billion into agriculture, how many days, do tomatoes grow? Between 90 to 120 days. Maize, yam, 6-7 months. By now, we'll be harvesting.
Right.
We'll be harvesting tomatoes, we'll be harvesting vegetables. Go to some of these states. You can't even see vegetable farms. Ordinary vegetables that, if ordinarily if you throw the seed on the floor, it will grow on its own. You can't see tomato farms. You cannot see onions. You cannot see maize. So they got this 2 billion naira, and what they did was that they just distributed palliatives. One-off. And we are not asking about ourselves. Do we want to live for today, or we want to live for the future? Right. If you want to live for the future, you must begin to think about investing in agriculture. And I think that's where some of these things, they get it wrong. Poultry, fishing, a lot sort of things that can create wealth, that can create opportunities for our people to have access to good food. Right. So our state governors, most of them are not getting it right. And I think that unless we address these fundamental issues, we begin to, perambulate on the same spot, that the issue of agriculture should be of paramount importance to state governors.
Mr. President, during his last speech to, of course, citizens had talked about the fact that a new minimum wage bill will be sent to the National Assembly. But just last week at the FEC, that again was set aside for wider consultation. And so in your own view, if Mr. President and his team are considering a wider consultation, what are some of the things that you think they must do, they must begin to consider in their wider consultation here? Also, how much of labor involvement should that wider consultation include? Because labor has said if they're not part of the negotiations, if they do not see the bill or some of the items in the bill before it is sent to National Assembly, then it is considered to them as they're not part of the stakeholders.
I think I agree with the federal government that there's a need for broader consultation. But what is also important, what is the content and form of that consultation? Who do you want to consult with?
Right.
So I think there's a need to consult widely. The Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, the Stock Exchange, the CBN, and I think the state governors, because they are the ones that we be compared to pay
at the state level.
At the state level. And also labor. Because it's like you cannot shave somebody's head, when it's not there. So you need to ensure that, the Nigerian Labour Congress is also part of this negotiation, because if you don't involve them, if there's no constructive engagement, whatever comes out of that negotiation will not be accepted to labor.
Right.
So I agree that they need to consult them, and also, a lot of stakeholders, they need to be, even the senators, the people in the National Assembly, they should go back to their constituency and fill the pox. That's why they were elected by the people. You don't just sit down in Abuja and then taking decisions. Go to your rural areas, find out the main challenges, the fears and aspirations of the people that elected you. What do they think about, about the new minimum wage? Every senator, at least you have members of AGON, civil servant, workers' union, you have them in your area. Go back, even at the state level, consult with labor. So I think there should be wide consultation, so that whatever we are coming out with, at least we will not have robbed Nigerians of the opportunity to make input to that discussion. Okay,
do you think labor would have been more considerate, or at least show some understanding to the federal government if part of what Mr. President had promised earlier, we have seen maybe a semblance of some seriousness on the part of the federal government? The CNG buses, we can only see few of them.
Only very few.
And those are part of the palliative that the federal government can actually give to workers.
Yeah. You see, I think that, just like you have said, you see, I think the federal government needs to do more. When you are talking about palliatives, we want to see transportation, for instance. Let's say in some states we're having about 50 buses that people can feel, people can relate with. So if the government can do certain things that labor will begin to see that they are serious, I think labor will begin to listen to them. But for now, most of the things that were being promised, we will only read them in the newspapers. When you go on the streets, you don't see these vehicles there. Even when they're there, they're very minimal. So transportation is major. And also we are talking about electricity. You know, look at what people are paying through in Ekiti State.
That tariff is still an issue. And Labour is saying they should cut it down.
They should cut it down. So because, you know, some people are paying, so you are in a three-bedroom flat, sometimes are paying, especially if you don't have prepaid meter, they can give you a bill of 200,000 naira. And how much do you earn at the end of the day? So it's a terrible thing, and we must realize that instability is usually a product of poverty. It's usually a product of exclusion. It's a product of, you know, when people don't have access to the essentials of life. It's going to bring distrust. It's going to create political and economic instability, which is an ill wind that blows nobody any good. The people in power will not benefit. Also, we, the masses, will not benefit. So we need to be sincere in our negotiations. The way we see government officials spend money, their lifestyle, you know, it diminishes the level of trust that Labour could have in them. So there should be sacrifice on both sides. If you're asking us to
tighten our belt,
you too also should.
We must see that you're
doing. Why are we
doing.
not talking about reducing the income of people in the National Assembly? Why are we not talking about that? Why can't they also raise it? It's in their own interest. For us to have a stable country, for us to have a prosperous country, that people will have some level of trust in those that are in power. Once there's no trust, it's a big risk for everyone, including those that are in government.
There seems to be some kind of uncertainty as we speak in the minds of the workers, and some are also thinking that if at the end of the day Labour, organized Labour and the federal government cannot reach a compromise, it could force government to also say they want to downsize. If at the end of the day they are forced to get to a figure where Labour is saying this is the maximum or the minimum we can take. Are you also worried here that there could, at some point in time, workers could be downsized?
It's a high possibility, you know, because when you are talking about minimum wage, like we said earlier, you have to look at the far-reaching implications. If you say the minimum wage should be 150,000 naira, for instance, a lot of people cannot pay the 150,000 naira. Will be left with no other option than to ask
people to go
in the civil service, in the private sector. Because if you are paying 150,000 naira, there is going to be a migration of labor. People will move from where there is higher opportunity. So the private sector will be affected. The government sector
will also be affected.
Civil society organizations will also be affected. Even here, where we are talking, will be affected. So we need to be reasonable to aggregate what is in the best interest of the government and also what is the best interest of the people. When you are also talking about downsizing, what would happen to those people? Are they going to go into agriculture when there are no opportunities, when the farms are not secured? I met one of the Southwest governors who downsized, I think, around the early 90s in one of the Southwest states. And what he did was that so many workers were let off they were sacked. And when I met him, I said, look, he lost the election for the second term because of that. So there's also the political implication of downsizing, no matter the way you look at it. I asked him, I said, look, maybe what should have done was to have restructured. Those workers, civil servants, should have taken them to Ministry of Agriculture. And he agreed with me, especially in the rural areas, that let them go and farm. But now, if we want to do it, we also have to look at security. If you don't provide security on those farms,
right?
If you deploy workers,
what if anything happens to them?
Then there is, so if you have to look at this thing holistically. If you want to downsize, it's not about retrenching. You must create an alternative for them where they can be more useful to the economy, not just to ask them to go home. But there are some areas, a private sector, we may not be able to have control when they begin to sack workers. So that's why the labor needs to be realistic. We need to ensure that decisions will not be counterproductive. So at the end of the day, we'll be regretting that. Why do we even call for, a new minimum wage?
Okay, in trying to be realistic here, what do you think should be the meeting point in such a way that Labour will have a bit of what they have, and of course the federal government will be able to accommodate the implementation of the new national minimum wage as well as the governors, aside from the 62,000 naira now?
Yeah. Well, I did a bit of overview, and I look at Kwara State, for instance, that the allocation for the federal government, Kwara State pays more than 70%, more than close to 80%, as a workers'
salary.
close to 80% or more. And I asked myself, there's not been any significant increase in terms of allocation for federal government. There's increase, but not significant.
Okay.
So if you now ask, and we are talking about at 30,000 naira minimum wage, if you now increase that amount to 62,000 naira, that means some states, their entire
Allocation will be used to pay salaries.
What about the IGR?
So yeah, even when you add the IGR, you know there are other state expenses, maintaining infrastructure and all that. But we are just, we're even looking at allocation for federal government because the IGR is not as much as, you know, compared with what, especially in most of the states in the rural area. So we have to weigh these options very well. And what will be important for people to have trust in the government is that they should also downsize the cost of governance. You know, if they can do that,
the number of aides that they have,
minimize, then minimize their expenses on other things that are not related to workers' welfare, people will begin to have trust in them. I know a governor in Southwest here that when he collects his salary, he will just call all the workers. Look, the person is no longer in power, but you call them, this is what we have. And we even call labor. At the end of the day, he spent 8 years, there was no labor crisis, even though he was not paying the salary as at when due. But they reasoned with him because they saw the salaries and they were open to them. So our government should be more transparent, and that's the best way you can have, improved trust between labor and the state government.
You don't want to put any figure at it?
Well, it's difficult now unless we do our extensive research. But I think if government can deal with certain issues of transportation, of education, we've had striking examples in our history. When Awolowo wanted to introduce free education in 1952, it took him between 1952 and 1954 to introduce free education. He introduced what they call salt tax, because you must buy you must buy salt. So everyone know you must pay salt tax. But people resisted. But he now said, look, if I'm not able to start if I'm not going to use this money judicially, I will resign. People even raise up arms in Badagry. You had to go to downtown Badagry on the river with the Oba of Badagry. They went to go and appeal to those people. They raised up arms to challenge him. But eventually, when he started that program, his children were also in public schools. He didn't take them to private schools. So there was that genuinity that people saw in him. And when he started with about 400,000 students in 1954, it turned out to be a success. Then they could not cope because they were anticipating 150,000 students. So by 1954, when they started, you know what they did? They went to each community all over Yoruba land, appealing to them, build your own schools, provide the shares, provide the land. And people did out of commitment. Right. And that was the beginning of community schools in Southwest. People built those schools. It became a competition. That's creativity. Those schools, some teachers even worked without pay. Bricklayers work without earning anything. Just
because it was their community.
Yeah, they were committed. Say, look, just build your own school. We'll come there and then. So there must be commitment. Our governors must be seen to be responsible. They must live a lifestyle that will make us to have trust and confidence in them.
We'll have to leave this conversation here this morning. Thank you so much, Adewale Adeoye, journalist, for finding time to be here with us on the program today. Well, of course, our guest here submitted that there has to be, genuinity from the governors. You must lead by example. If indeed you'd like to end the trust of the people, you must ensure that, of course, you bring governance close to them. We do hope that Labour and the federal government of Nigeria will, in the soonest time, come to an agreement as to how the new minimum wage will go. We'll take a quick break. When we return, the conversation continues.